My wind is gusting 14 knots, full value left to right, the spotter whispered, his voice dry as the desert dust coating his lips. Mirage is boiling, Elena. You cannot see the target clearly. I do not need to see it, Elena murmured, her cheek pressed against the burning polymer of the stock. I need to feel it. Hey, sweetheart! Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the concentration like a jagged knife, loud and lacking discipline. He stood 10 feet behind the firing line, arms crossed, his shadow stretching over her shoulder. Did you hear me? I said that scope costs more than your car. Don't strip the screws when you pretend to adjust it. The laughter from his squad was a low rumble, distinct from the howl of the desert wind. Elena did not flinch. She did not turn. Her finger hovered millimeters from the trigger guard. Her breathing slowed, artificially dropping her heart rate until the blood pounding in her ears faded into a rhythmic thump. She is shaking, a younger Marine whispered, mistaking the micro-adjustments of her muscular tension for fear. She is going to miss by a mile, Miller scoffed, taking a step closer, invading her tactical space. Save the ammo, honey. Let the men handle the heavy hardware. Elena closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. In that darkness, the heat vanished. The mockery vanished. There was only the math of the trajectory and the memory of 500 confirmed kills that no one in this base knew about. She opened her eyes, the crosshair settled on a shimmering speck 1,200 meters away. Watch, she whispered, exhaling the last breath in her lungs. Crack. The sound was not a bang, but a whip crack that split the heavy afternoon air, followed instantly by the metallic ping of impact, echoing back like a ghost. The sun over Al-Sahra Joint Base was not a celestial body. It was a hostile entity, a white-hot eye pressing down on the earth with the weight of judgment. Even at 0600 hours, the heat was already rising from the cracked hardpan, creating shimmering waves of distortion that made the distant mountains look like they were melting into the sky. Elena Vrova sat alone on the concrete bench of Range 7, the furthest and most neglected firing lane in the sector. To the casual observer, she looked like nothing more than civilian contractor debris. A woman in her late 30s with gray-streaked hair pulled back into a severe, functional bun. Wearing cargo pants that had seen better decades and a faded tan t-shirt stained with gun oil. Her posture was hunched, not from submission, but from the fused vertebrae in her lower back that screamed in protest whenever the barometric pressure shifted. On the table before her lay the disassembled components of a McMillan Tac-50 sniper rifle. It was a beast of a weapon, scarred and scratched, its finish worn down to the bare metal in places where hands had gripped it too tight for too long. Easy, old girl, Elena whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. She ran a cloth soaked in solvent through the massive barrel. The smell of the chemical was sharp and biting, a scent that triggered memories she usually kept locked behind a mental blast door. She worked with a slow, deliberate cadence. Every movement was an economy of motion. There was no wasted energy. Her fingers, calloused and scarred, danced over the firing pin and the bolt assembly with the intimacy of a lover and the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't just cleaning a rifle, she was performing a ritual. In the chaos of her mind, where the faces of the dead sometimes screamed too loudly, the mechanical logic of the weapon was the only order she could trust. Al-Sahra was waking up around her. In the distance, the dull thrum of C-130 Hercules transport planes taking off from the main strip vibrated through the ground, traveling up through the soles of her boots. She ignored it. She ignored the scorpion scuttling in the shade of the sandbags. She ignored the pain radiating down her left leg. "Calibration day," she muttered, sliding the heavy bolt back into the receiver with a satisfying clack-clack. "Just you and me." She didn't want to be here, or rather, she didn't want to be seen here. After the incident in the Hindu Kush, the one that had earned her the medical discharge and the nightmares, she had retreated into the shadows. She was a technical advisor now, a ghost who fixed broken optics and diagnosed trajectory errors for the young, eager boys who thought war was a video game. They called her Ms. Vrova. They didn't know her call sign was Wraith. They didn't know she had been attached to DEVGRU before most of them had even hit puberty, and she preferred it that way. Fame was heavy. Anonymity was light. But solitude at Al-Sahra was a rare commodity. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of intruders. Elena didn't look up, but her ears picked out the distinct, aggressive growl of a Humvee engine pushing too hard in low gear. The vehicle approached rapidly, the tires crunching gravel with unnecessary violence before screeching to a halt 20 yards behind her position. "All right, ladies. Let's move. Range is hot in 5. The voice was loud, booming, and laced with the artificial bravado of a man who loved the sound of his own authority. Sergeant Miller. Elena didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She had seen his file. A Marine Corps transfer, good scores on paper. But he walked with the swagger of someone who hadn't yet learned that the desert didn't care about his rank. Door slammed, boots hit the ground. The chaotic chatter of a dozen young Marines filled the sacred silence of the range. "Sarge, someone's on the lane," a voice called out. "Civilian," Miller's voice replied, dismissive and sharp. "Probably maintenance. Tell her to pack up. We have this sector booked for high-angle drills." Elena tightened the final screw on the scope mount. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge them. She just felt the wind pick up, a hot breath against the back of her neck, whispering that a storm was coming. Not a sandstorm, but a storm of egos, and she was right in the eye of it. The up-armored HMMWV did not park. It invaded. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, its suspension groaning under the weight of armor plating and excessive gear, finally coming to a halt less than 10 meters from Elena's bench. The proximity was a violation of unwritten range etiquette, a deliberate intrusion into her tactical bubble. Doors swung open with heavy metallic thuds. Boots hit the gravel. Clean, well-polished boots that hadn't yet seen the deep, scarring traverses of the Hindu Kush or the Syrian border. 6 Marines spilled out, clad in desert marpat camouflage that looked crisp and fresh. They moved with the energetic, slightly chaotic urgency of men who were eager to shoot something but hadn't yet learned the discipline of stillness. Leading them was Sergeant Miller. He was a physical specimen, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing his plate carrier even though it wasn't required for a simple range day. He wanted to look the part. He adjusted his sunglasses, scanned the horizon with a practiced squint, and then let his gaze fall on the figure at the bench. "What is this?" Miller asked, his voice carrying over the idling diesel engine. "I thought range control said Sector 7 was clear." "It's just some contractor. Sergeant." The driver, a corporal with a lip full of chewing tobacco, leaned out the window. "Probably testing optics for the armory. Do you want me to tell her to move?" Miller didn't answer immediately. He watched Elena. She hadn't flinched when the doors slammed. She hadn't looked up when they started talking. She was currently running a dry patch through the chamber of the Tac-50, her movements slow and rhythmic, completely ignoring the platoon of armed men standing behind her. It irked him. It was a lack of respect. In Miller's world, hierarchy was visual and acoustic. He was the loudest, biggest thing in the area, and therefore, he should be the center of gravity. "No," Miller said, a thin smile touching his lips. He signaled the driver with a sharp, chopping motion of his hand. "Bring the truck around. Park it right there. Shield the wind for the boys." He pointed to a spot directly upwind of Elena's bench. The corporal grinned, understanding the subtext immediately. He shifted the Humvee into gear and gunned the engine. The massive tires churned the loose, silty sand of the desert floor. As the vehicle swung around, the exhaust pipe belched a thick cloud of black smoke, and the tires kicked up a wall of brown dust that the wind immediately seized and threw directly at the concrete bench. It was a petty, aggressive maneuver, a dust-off designed to choke out anyone unfortunate enough to be downwind. The cloud engulfed Elena. For a moment, she disappeared entirely inside the brown haze. The Marines laughed, high-fiving each other as they began unloading their gear cases, expecting to see the woman coughing, waving her hands, and hastily packing up her antique rifle to flee the discomfort. But as the dust began to settle, drifting away on the hot thermal currents, the laughter died down. Elena had not moved. She had not coughed. In the seconds before the dust hit, she had simply leaned forward, shielding the open action of the rifle with her body and covering the expensive optics with a gloved hand. She sat hunched over the weapon like a gargoyle, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow to filter out the particulates. As the air cleared, she straightened up. She brushed a layer of silt off her shoulder with a single dismissive swipe. She didn't look at the truck. She didn't look at Miller. She picked up a lens pen and began to meticulously clean the dust from the scope's objective lens, as if the Marines were nothing more than a sudden, unpredictable shift in the weather. Miller's smile vanished. The prank had failed. Instead of asserting dominance, he had been rendered irrelevant by her absolute indifference. "All right," Miller barked, his voice sharper now, stripped of its earlier amusement. "Get the gear on the line? Don't just stand there gawking. We have range time to burn." He strode toward the firing line, his boots crunching loudly on the ground, determined to make his presence felt since his vehicle had failed to do so. Elena retrieved a small, weather-beaten notebook from her cargo pocket. The cover was frayed, the pages crinkled from past exposure to humidity and sweat, but it was the most valuable item on the table. It was her DOPE book, Data on Previous Engagement. Every shot she had taken in this sector for the past 6 months was recorded here. Temperature, barometric pressure, spin drift, and the Coriolis effect. She held up her Kestrel wind meter. The small impeller spun lazily at first, then whipped into a blur as a gust rolled off the dunes. The digital display flickered. 8 miles per hour, 9 o'clock, full value. Then, 2 seconds later, 4 miles per hour, 7 o'clock. "Variable," she whispered, penning the numbers into the grid. The wind here was a liar. It promised one thing and delivered another. Behind her, the sanctity of the range had been completely shattered. The platoon was not setting up with the quiet professionalism of experienced operators. They were setting up with the raucous energy of a college football team. Gear cases were thrown onto the gravel. Heavy semi-automatic sniper systems, likely M110s, were being racked and dry-fired with unnecessary force. "Check it out," one voice carried over the wind, loud and mocking. "Grandma brought a musket." "Maybe she thinks this is the antique roadshow," another voice chimed in. followed by a chorus of guffaws. Elena did not turn. She kept her eyes on the heat waves rising from the sand, trying to read the boil, the optical distortion that revealed the true wind direction downrange. But the chatter was like static in her headset, a constant, grating interference that made the complex trigonometry in her head difficult to hold. Miller, who was overseeing the deployment of the bipods, noticed that the civilian woman had not taken the hint. She was still sitting there, occupying the primary bench, writing in her little diary. He sighed, an exaggerated exhalation of annoyance meant for his audience. "Davis!" Miller barked. "Sergeant?" A young private first class popped up, looking eager to please. "Go tell the lady she is in a live fire zone," Miller said, gesturing vaguely at Elena's back. "Tell her we need the lane for qualification drills. Kindly ask her to relocate to the pistol range or the parking lot." "Aye, Sergeant." Davis jogged over, his boots kicking up small spurts of sand. He adjusted his rifle sling, puffing out his chest. He was young, perhaps 19, with a face that hadn't yet lost its baby fat. He stopped 2 feet from Elena's bench. "Ma'am," Davis said, pitching his voice to be authoritative. "Excuse me, ma'am." Elena finished writing the number 24.5 in the elevation column. She capped her pen. Slowly, she swiveled on the bench to face him. Davis had prepared a speech. He had prepared to be firm but polite. But when Elena looked up, the words died in his throat. Her eyes were not angry. They were not annoyed. They were simply empty. It was the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen souls leave bodies and had long since stopped wondering where they went. It was a look of such profound, hollow indifference that it made Davis feel incredibly small, as if he were nothing more than a temporary obstruction in her line of sight. The silence stretched. The wind howled between them. Davis stammered. He looked back at Miller for support, then back at the woman. The scar running from her hairline to her ear was visible now, white and jagged against her tanned skin. Elena did not say a word. She just held his gaze, unblinking, until the discomfort became physical. Davis took an involuntary half-step back, his combat boots scuffling on the concrete. "Is there a problem, Private?" Miller's voice boomed from the line, dripping with impatience. Davis jumped. "No, Sergeant. I mean, she's not moving, Sergeant." Elena turned back to her scope, dismissing the boy as if he had ceased to exist. Miller ground his teeth. He handed his own rifle to the Marine next to him and cracked his knuckles. The direct approach had failed. Now he had to assert his dominance personally, or risk losing the respect of the entire squad. Sergeant Miller did not just walk. He projected force. He closed the distance to the concrete bench with heavy, deliberate strides, his shadow elongating across the ground until it fell directly over Elena's hands, eclipsing the sunlight she was using to inspect her scope rings. It was a classic intimidation tactic, blocking the light, invading the personal bubble, forcing the other person to look up and acknowledge the obstruction. "I don't think you heard my private," Miller said. His voice was dropped an octave lower than usual, a tone practiced in front of mirrors to sound commanding. "Or maybe the hearing protection is too tight." Elena paused. Her fingers stopped moving on the windage knob. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she slowly exhaled, a long, controlled breath that emptied her lungs of frustration. "I heard him," she said, her voice quiet, raspy, and utterly devoid of the fear he expected. She turned her head slowly, lifting her chin just enough to meet his gaze behind his polarized Oakleys. "He said you needed the lane. I am currently calibrating. I will be done when the barrel creates a heat mirage that distorts the target. Not before. Miller blinked. He hadn't expected pushback. He certainly hadn't expected technical jargon delivered with such flat, bored confidence. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, the nylon of his plate carrier creaking with the movement. "Look, lady," he chuckled, a sound that was more bark than humor. "I don't know who signed your contractor pass, but this is a military firing range. It's for warfighters, not for hobbyists checking zero on their hunting rifles." He looked down at the weapon on the table. For the first time, he really looked at it. It was a McMillan Tac-50, a 50 caliber anti-materiel rifle. But it was ugly. The polymer stock was gouged deep near the butt plate. The camouflage paint was worn away to reveal the dull gray fiberglass underneath, and the bolt handle was discolored from years of sweat and oil. To Miller, whose squad carried factory-fresh M110s with pristine suppressors, this weapon looked like garbage. It looked like something dug out of a scrapyard. "Jesus," Miller scoffed, shaking his head. "Where did you find this relic? A museum gift shop? That thing looks like it fell off a truck during Desert Storm." He reached out, his finger hovering inches from the scope, as if to flick a speck of dust from the lens. "Don't touch it," Elena said. She didn't shout. She didn't move fast. She simply spoke with the absolute finality of a closing coffin lid. Miller pulled his hand back, more out of surprise than obedience. He laughed again, louder this time, performing for the audience of young Marines standing behind him. "Relax. I'm not going to break your antique," he sneered. "I'm just saying, maybe you should stick to something lighter. That's a 50 cal. It kicks like a mule. It's not meant for—" He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her slender frame, her graying hair, the way her shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of her own history. "It's not meant for civilians, especially not female ones." Elena looked at the deep gouge on the stock. Miller saw a scratch. She saw the shrapnel from an RPG that had taken her spotter's head off in the Pech Valley. She saw the weapon that had stopped a Vu Bayed from breaching the perimeter at 300 meters. She felt a surge of pity, hot and bitter, for the man standing before her. He saw war as equipment lists and clean uniforms. He didn't know that the best weapons, like the best soldiers, were always scarred. "It is heavy," Elena admitted softly, her eyes returning to the target downrange. "Gravity applies to everyone, Sergeant." "Exactly," Miller grinned, feeling like he had won the point. "So why don't you pack up the heavy hardware and let the men handle the work? You don't want to dislocate a shoulder trying to impress us." The insult hung in the hot air between them, vibrating with a frequency that Elena knew too well. Dislocate a shoulder. It was the kind of comment that would have earned a broken nose in a bar, or a disciplinary report in a briefing room. But out here, under the blinding sun of Sector 7, it was just another layer of noise. Elena did not respond immediately. Instead, for a fractured second, the desert vanished. The blinding white light of Al-Sahra was replaced by the suffocating darkness of a mountain pass in the Hindu Kush. She was back in Operation Black Sand. The air didn't smell of ozone and dry scrub. It smelled of copper blood and burning diesel. She felt the weight again, not the rifle. The rifle was light compared to the body of her spotter, draped over her shoulders like a wet, heavy blanket. She could hear the radio static screaming in her earpiece, a chaotic symphony of jammed frequencies and panicked calls for medevac that would never come in time. "Leave it, Wraith. He's gone. Move." The command had crackled through the comms. but she hadn't moved. She had dug her boots into the scree, her spine screaming as she hauled the dead weight up the ridgeline, firing one-handed with this very rifle to keep the heads of the insurgents down. That was where the vertebrae had fused. That was where the pain had started. A permanent, fiery line running down her back that no amount of surgery could fully erase. Miller's laugh brought her back. The sound was jarring, pulling her out of the blood-soaked memory and back to the sterile safety of the firing range. Elena blinked. The ghost of the dead spotter faded, replaced by the flushed, arrogant face of Sergeant Miller. A sharp spasm of pain shot through her lower lumbar region, a physical anchor grounding her in the present. She welcomed the pain. It was clarity. It was a reminder that she was alive and dangerous, while the boy in front of her was merely loud. She looked at Miller, really looked at him. She saw the uncertainty flickering behind his polarized lenses. He was waiting for her to explode, to cry or to pack up in shame. He wanted a reaction that fit his narrative of the world. She denied him that satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, Elena reached into the heavy canvas bag at her feet. She bypassed the cleaning kit. She bypassed the lens cloth. Her hand closed around the cold, rectangular shape of a steel box magazine. It was heavy, loaded with 5 rounds of 50 BMG match-grade ammunition. Each cartridge was the size of a man's hand, a brass casing topped with a sleek aerodynamic projectile designed to travel miles and punch through engine blocks. Miller's smirk faltered. "Whoa, hold on! What do you think you're doing?" Elena didn't answer. She lifted the magazine onto the table. The sound of it hitting the concrete was a heavy, dull thud that silenced the whispering Marines behind Miller. It wasn't the sound of packing up. It was the sound of digging in. With a fluid motion that belied the stiffness in her back, she tilted the rifle slightly. She aligned the magazine with the well. Click. The magazine locked into place with a mechanical finality that echoed across the range. It was a sound of violence made ready. "You are worried about my shoulder, Sergeant?" Elena said, her voice dropping to a register that was almost intimate in its calmness. She reached for the bolt handle. "That is very kind of you. But the recoil is only a problem if you fight the physics. I stopped fighting a long time ago." She cycled the bolt. The massive steel action slid back, picked up a round, and slammed it into the chamber. The weapon was now hot. The safety was the only thing holding back the storm. "I am not leaving," she stated, turning her gaze downrange to the shimmering horizon. "And since you are so concerned with my equipment, perhaps you should watch how it works." Miller stared at the closed bolt of the Tac-50. The metallic sound of the round chambering had been a punctuation mark he hadn't expected, a sentence ending he hadn't authorized. For a moment, the sheer audacity of the woman stunned him. Then, the embarrassment washed over him, hot and prickly, quickly hardening into anger. She wasn't just ignoring him. She was actively defying him in front of his squad. He took a step closer, crossing the safety line painted on the concrete. "Loading is the easy part, honey," Miller said, his voice dropping the pretense of politeness. "Pulling the trigger on a 50 cal without breaking your collarbone is another story. You clearly don't know the physics involved here. That rifle produces 12,000 foot-pounds of energy. It's not a toy for bored technicians." He looked back at his men, seeking validation. They were shifting uncomfortably, sensing the shift in atmosphere from playful mockery to genuine hostility. But they chuckled nervously, obligated by rank to support their leader. "I'm serious," Miller continued, turning back to Elena. He gestured broadly at her seated position, Look at your posture. You're too stiff. You're going to take all that recoil straight into the joint. I've seen grown men, Marines with twice your muscle mass, cry after 5 rounds because they didn't respect the weapon. You think you can just sit there and plink away? Elena ignored the critique of her form. Her form was perfect, drilled into her muscle memory by thousands of hours in mud, snow, and sand. She was melding with the rifle, finding the natural point of aim, her cheek welding to the stock. The sun was higher now, beating down with relentless intensity. A beam of light caught the face of Miller's oversized tactical watch, reflecting a sharp, blinding glint directly into Elena's peripheral vision. It was annoying, a jagged shard of light piercing her concentration. "If you are going to stand there," Elena said, her voice muffled slightly as she pressed her face against the stock, "move 3 inches to the left. You are reflecting light." Miller scoffed, incredulous. "I'm reflecting light? You're unbelievable. You're about to embarrass yourself, and you're worried about my watch?" He shook his head and looked downrange. The heat mirage was boiling now, making the distant targets dance and shimmy like ghosts in the desert air. "Fine," Miller said, his tone turning challenging. "You want to shoot? Let's see what you've got. But we aren't shooting at paper at 300 yards. That's waste of ammo." He extended a thick arm, pointing toward the furthest berm, a hazy line of brown earth barely distinguishing itself from the horizon. "See that steel plate at the end of the valley?" Miller asked, squinting against the glare. "Range is 1,200 meters. My boys set up 5 spent .50 caliber casings on top of it this morning for a wager. They are 4 inches tall. At this distance, they are smaller than a pinhead." He looked down at her, a smirk playing on his lips. It was an impossible shot. The wind was gusting, the mirage was heavy, and the target was microscopic. Even his best designated marksman would struggle to hit the steel plate, let alone the tiny brass casings sitting on top of it. "You knock one of those off, and maybe I'll let you stay," Miller taunted, confident in the impossibility of the task. "But if you miss, and you will miss, you pack up your gear, you leave my range, and you apologize to my squad for wasting our time." Elena finally pulled her eye away from the scope. She looked at the distant berm, then up at Miller. The sun glare from his watch flashed again, but this time she didn't blink. The disdain in her gut had vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. He had given her parameters. He had given her a mission. "One casing?" she asked softly. "Sure," Miller laughed. "Hit one, and you're the queen of the desert." Elena turned back to the rifle. She didn't adjust her position. She didn't check the wind meter again. She had felt the gust on her cheek. She had seen the grass bending at 600 yards. The math was already done. "Watch," she whispered. The desert floor began to hiss. It was the sound of millions of grains of sand shifting simultaneously as the wind picked up, dragging a veil of heat and dust across the firing range. The flags on the berms snapped violently, straining against their poles. To an untrained eye, it was just weather. To a sniper, it was a living, breathing variable that could push a .50 caliber projectile 3 feet off course over a 1,000-meter flight path. Elena leaned into the rifle. Her world narrowed down to the circular view of the scope. The mil-dot reticle was black and sharp against the shimmering background. At 1,200 meters, the target berm was a blurry tan line, and the 5 brass casings were invisible to the naked eye. Through the high-powered optic, They were merely shimmering slivers of gold, ghosting in and out of the mirage. She closed her eyes for a second, tuning out the harsh sunlight. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't alone. The ghost was there. "Wind is gusting 14 knots, full value left to right," the voice whispered in her ear. It was dry, calm, and familiar. It was the voice of her spotter, dead 3 years, but always present when she was behind the glass. "Mirage is boiling, Elena. You cannot see the target clearly." "I do not need to see it," Elena murmured, her lips barely moving against the stock. "I need to feel it." She opened her eyes. The data was real, even if the voice wasn't. The grass at the midpoint was flattened. The mirage was flowing from left to right like a river. She dialed the windage knob on the side of the scope. Click, click, click. 3 minutes of angle into the wind. "Hey, sweetheart!" The reality of Al-Sahra crashed back in, shattering the delicate communion she held with her weapon. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through her concentration like a jagged knife, loud and lacking discipline. He stood 10 feet behind the firing line, arms crossed, his shadow stretching over her shoulder, oblivious to the sacrosanct silence required for a long-range engagement. "Did you hear me?" Miller yelled over the wind. "I said that scope costs more than your car. Don't strip the screws when you pretend to adjust it." Behind him, the squad of Marines rumbled with low laughter. It was a pack mentality, feeding off the leader's confidence. They saw a middle-aged woman fiddling with knobs she couldn't possibly understand. Elena did not flinch. She did not turn. Her finger hovered millimeters from the trigger guard. Her breathing slowed, artificially dropping her heart rate until the blood pounding in her ears faded into a rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. "She is shaking," a younger Marine whispered, misinterpreting the micro-adjustments of her muscular tension as nerves. Miller took a step closer, invading her tactical space, his boots scuffing the concrete. "She is going to miss by a mile. Save the ammo, honey. Let the men handle the heavy hardware." Then came the words that sealed the moment in amber. "You'll miss, sweetheart," Miller scoffed. The word sweetheart hung in the air. For Elena, it wasn't an insult. It was a key turning in a lock. It stripped away the last vestiges of Elena Vrova, the tired contractor with the bad back. It unlocked Wraith. The heat vanished. The mockery vanished. The desert became a grid of mathematical probabilities. She wasn't angry at Miller. You don't get angry at a child for not understanding calculus. You just solve the equation. She exhaled. The breath left her lungs in a long, controlled stream, creating a respiratory pause. That brief moment of physiological stillness between exhalation and inhalation where the body is most stable. The crosshair settled. It didn't aim at the casing. It aimed into the empty air to the left of the casing, holding for the wind that only she could feel. "Watch," she whispered. Her finger applied 2 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The sear broke. Crack. The sound was not a bang. It was a physical blow to the atmosphere. The massive muzzle brake on the tip of the Tac-50 vented high-pressure gas sideways and backwards, creating a concussive shockwave that kicked up a semicircle of dust around the bench. The recoil slammed into Elena's shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet, a violent shove that she absorbed through her skeletal structure, grounding it into the concrete beneath her. For most people, the shot ends when the trigger is pulled. For a long-range shooter, that is only the beginning of the wait. At a distance of 1,200 meters, The .50 caliber bullet does not arrive instantly. There is a hang time, a gap of roughly 1.8 seconds where the projectile is alone in the universe, battling gravity and wind. In those nearly 2 seconds, Elena did not blink. She did not breathe. She held the follow-through, keeping the trigger pinned to the rear, her eye glued to the scope to track the trace. The heat mirage swirled, but through the distortion, she saw the disturbance in the air, a vapor trail slicing through the atmosphere like a boat wake on a calm lake. It arched high, rising above the line of sight before gravity began to drag it down. It drifted right, pushed by the 14-knot gust, exactly as she had calculated. Clang. The sound of impact returned faint and delayed, a ghostly metallic ring carried back on the wind. Through the scope, the image was undeniable. The first brass casing on the left side of the steel plate didn't just fall over, it evaporated. The heavy 750-grain bullet had clipped it with such kinetic energy that the casing was spun violently into the air, flashing gold against the brown berm before disappearing into the dirt. Elena cycled the bolt immediately. Click, clack. The empty casing from her own rifle ejected, spinning onto the concrete table, smoking hot. She pushed the bolt forward, chambering a fresh round, her eyes never leaving the optic. The silence behind her was heavier than the rifle itself. The laughter had been severed as cleanly as if by a guillotine. The nervous shuffling of boots had stopped. The wind seemed to be the only thing daring to make a sound. Elena exhaled, her breath hissing through her teeth. 1 down, 4 to go. She glanced at the wind flags on the range. They were shifting. The gust that had carried her first shot was dying down, replaced by a lull. A lull was dangerous. If she fired with the same hold, she would miss to the left. Luck! Miller's voice broke the silence, though it lacked the booming confidence from before. It sounded thin, strained. That was pure luck. The wind took it. You aimed center and got blown onto the target. He was talking to his men, not to her. He was trying to rewrite the reality they had just witnessed, desperate to frame the impossible shot as a statistical anomaly rather than a display of skill. Anyone can get a lucky hit with a .50 cal, Miller continued, his voice rising slightly as he tried to convince himself. It's an area weapon. The splash damage probably knocked it over. Do it again. I bet my rank you can't do it again. Elena didn't respond to the taunt. She didn't feel the need to defend the shot. The bullet had spoken for her. But Miller was right about one thing. The wind was changing. The mirage was no longer flowing like a river. It was bubbling straight up. The air was still. She adjusted her aim. She removed the 3 minutes of windage hold, bringing the crosshair back to the center of the second casing. She didn't wait for Miller to finish his sentence. She didn't wait for the doubt to settle in the minds of the spectators. She respected the rhythm of the rifle. Feed, fire, extract, repeat. Watch the boil, she whispered to herself. The desert air was a deceitful creature. Just as the dust from the first shot settled, the flags downrange snapped in the opposite direction. The wind, which had been pushing hard from the left, suddenly died and reversed, creating a fishtailing effect that was the nightmare of every long-range shooter. Miller was still talking, his voice a low buzz of rationalization in the background, but Elena had tuned him out completely. Her universe was confined to the view through the optic. If she listened to Miller, she would lose the rhythm. If she paused to check her data book, the wind would change again. She didn't reach for the windage turret this time. There was no time to dial. She had to use the reticle itself, holding the crosshair slightly to the right of the target to compensate for the new draft. It was a technique that required feel more than math, a dark art she had mastered in the high peaks of the Hindu Kush, where the wind screamed from 3 directions at once. Hold right. 0.4 mils, she thought, the calculation flashing through her mind like a lightning strike. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the trigger. Crack. The rifle bucked. The second round tore through the superheated air. Because she hadn't dialed the adjustment, she had to trust her eye completely. The flight time stretched out, an agonizing wait. Clang. The second brass casing spun violently off the steel plate, struck by the invisible hammer of the .50 caliber projectile. 2. Elena whispered. She didn't look up to see Miller's reaction. She didn't check the target. Her hand was already moving, flying to the bolt handle. Up, back, forward, down. The motion was fluid, aggressive, and incredibly fast for a bolt action system. The spent casing from the second shot ejected, clattering onto the concrete table to join the first. She's cycling fast, a Marine murmured, his voice filled with reluctant awe. She's not resetting. He was right. Elena wasn't resetting her body position. She was riding the recoil, letting the rifle settle back into the pocket of her shoulder naturally. But the wind wasn't done playing games. As she locked the bolt on the third round, the Mirage boiled straight up again, a sign of zero wind. A dead lull. This was the trap. If she held off to the right again, she would miss. If she dialed left, she would miss. She had to aim dead center, trusting that the lull would last for the 2 seconds of bullet flight. It was a gamble. It was a test of faith in the elements. Elena breathed out, her lungs emptying until she reached the natural respiratory pause. The crosshair stopped dancing. It hovered perfectly over the center of the third casing. Crack. The third shot broke the silence before the echo of the second had even fully faded. It was a rhythm of violence. Boom, cycle, boom, cycle, boom. The delay felt longer this time. The heat waves distorted the image, making the target wobble. For a split second, Elena thought she had misread the lull. Clang. The sound was sweeter than music. The third casing vanished from the berm. Elena cycled the bolt again, leaving the action open this time to let the barrel cool for a fraction of a second. Steam, or perhaps just heat haze, was rising from the muzzle brake. The smell of burnt gunpowder was thick and pungent, swirling around her like incense. She finally pulled her head back from the scope, just an inch, to blink the sweat from her eyelashes. The silence behind her was different now. It wasn't the silence of skepticism. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of shock. Sergeant Miller was standing exactly where she had left him, but his posture had collapsed. His arms were no longer crossed defiantly. They hung by his sides. His mouth was slightly open. The sweat running down his temple wasn't from the heat. It was cold sweat. 3, Elena said, her voice cutting through the stillness without raising a decibel. Still luck, Sergeant? Miller swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly. He looked at the 3 empty spots on the distant steel plate, then down at the battered rifle that he had called garbage moments ago. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he hadn't just insulted a civilian contractor. He had walked into a lion's den and poked the sleeping beast. 2 left, Miller croaked, his voice dry. He was no longer betting his rank. He was praying she would miss, just so he could salvage a shred of his dignity. 3 rounds down, 2 remained. But in long-range precision, the math does not get easier with repetition. It gets harder. The barrel of the Tac-50 was heating up, creating its own microclimate of shimmering air directly in front of the scope. This barrel mirage, mixed with the atmospheric mirage rising from the desert floor, creating a compound distortion that turned the circular view of the world into a swimming, oil-painting mess. Elena felt the strain first in her right eye. Squinting against the harsh glare of the Arabian sun for this long was taking its toll. The muscles around her socket twitched involuntarily. A bead of sweat, salty and stinging, broke loose from her hairline, bypassed the eyebrow she couldn't wipe, and trickled directly into the corner of her shooting eye. It burned like acid. Most shooters would have pulled back. They would have called a check fire, sat up, wiped their face, and started the process over. But Elena knew the wind was in a transition phase. If she broke her position now, she would lose the dope. She would lose the connection she had forged with the air currents. She didn't move. She didn't blink the sting away. She accepted the pain as just another variable, another piece of data to be processed and discarded. Through the scope, the fourth brass casing looked like it was underwater. It danced left, then right, then elongated into a golden streak. This was the lie of the mirage. It tried to trick the brain into aiming at where the target appeared to be, not where it actually was. "Don't chase the ghost," she told herself. She needed a reset. Her retinas were burned out, saturated by the intensity of the light. Elena closed her eyes. The world went black. The burning sensation in her eye throbbed, but in the darkness, the chaos subsided. She wasn't doing this for Miller anymore. His arrogance had faded into background noise, irrelevant and small. She wasn't doing this to prove a point to the Marines. She was doing this because, for the first time in 3 years, the noise in her head had stopped. The PTSD, the guilt, the faces of the dead, they couldn't survive in the absolute focus required for this shot. In this darkness, she was whole. She was Wraith again. 1. She breathed in, smelling the cordite. 2. She felt the pulse in her fingertips settle. 3. She snapped her eyes open. For a fraction of a second, her vision was crystal clear. The rod and cone cells in her eyes had reset. The mirage was still there, but she could see through it now. She saw the true edge of the fourth casing. She saw the slight boil of the air pushing upward and slightly left. She didn't wait for the picture to degrade. She didn't second guess. The crosshair was already where it needed to be. Crack. The fourth shot surprised even her. It was an instinctive break, a subconscious reaction to the perfect sight picture. The rifle roared, shoving her shoulder back with familiar violence. Downrange, the physics played out with brutal elegance. The bullet sliced through the heat, ignoring the lies of the light. Clang. The impact was solid, louder than the others, perhaps because the silence on the range had become absolute. The fourth casing didn't just spin. It was sheared in half, sending sparkling fragments of brass tumbling down the berm. 4. Elena exhaled, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. She worked the bolt. Click, clack. The heavy steel slid back and forth, smooth as silk on glass. The fourth empty casing from her rifle joined the pile on the table. She glanced at the magazine. 1 round left, 1 round to finish the sentence she had started. Behind her, Miller didn't speak. He didn't shift his weight. He was watching the target through his binoculars, frozen like a statue. He was witnessing something he had only read about in after-action reports. The kind of shooting that gets talked about in hushed tones in NCO clubs. The arrogance had been flayed from him, layer by layer, shot by shot. Now there was only dread, the dread of the final, undeniable proof. The bolt slid forward for the final time, picking up the last cartridge from the magazine. It was a mechanical caress, the steel lug guiding the brass into the chamber with a smoothness that defied the violence it was about to unleash. Elena locked the handle down. The rifle was live. The magazine was empty. There is a superstition among snipers about the cold bore shot, the first one, and the cleanup shot, the last one. The first proves you are ready. The last proves you are consistent. To miss the fifth shot after hitting 4 is not just a failure, it is a tragedy. It undoes everything that came before. The silence on range 7 had achieved a physical density. The wind had dropped to a whisper, as if the desert itself was holding its breath to see the conclusion. The earlier jeers, the laughter, the sound of chewing tobacco being spit onto the gravel, it was all gone. Elena rested her cheek on the stock. The polymer was warm, almost hot against her skin. She didn't look through the scope immediately. She took a moment to center herself, listening to the rhythm of her own body. Thump, thump, thump. Her heart rate was low, hovering around 48 beats per minute. It was the pulse of a hibernating animal, or perhaps a predator lying in wait. Behind her, Sergeant Miller stood frozen. He was no longer the loud-mouthed NCO trying to impress his subordinates. He was a man witnessing a magic trick he couldn't explain. He had his binoculars pressed so hard against his eyes that they would leave rings. Through the magnified lenses, he stared at the solitary brass casing left on the berm. It looked lonely. It looked doomed. Miller realized his lungs were burning. He hadn't taken a breath in 20 seconds. He was subconsciously mirroring Elena's respiratory cycle, caught in the gravitational pull of her focus. He wanted to speak, to make a joke, to break the tension that was suffocating his squad, but his voice box refused to cooperate. Elena opened her eyes. The crosshair was black, stark, and unforgiving. A wave of melancholy washed over her, sudden and sharp. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was a profound, aching sadness. This was what she was good at. She couldn't fix her marriage. She couldn't fix her back. She couldn't fix the memories that woke her up screaming at 0300. But she could hit a 4-inch target at 1.2 kilometers. She was a master of destruction in a world that demanded construction. Focus, she whispered to the ghost in her head. The target was clear. The mirage had settled into a gentle boil. The wind was negligible. There were no excuses left. It was just geometry and execution. She exhaled. She pushed all the air out until her lungs were empty, reaching the physiological flatline where the body is most still. The crosshair stopped moving. It hovered over the center of the casing like the hand of fate. She squeezed the trigger. She didn't pull it. She increased pressure until the machine surprised her. Crack. The recoil was a familiar friend, a shove that told her the message had been sent. The flight time seemed to last an hour. Elena kept her eye open, watching the trace. The bullet arc was perfect, a high parabola against the blue-white sky. It began its descent, dropping with the inevitability of gravity. Clang. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a period placed at the end of a sentence. The fifth casing didn't spin. It didn't tumble. It was struck dead center, blasted backwards off the steel plate into the oblivion of the sand behind the berm. The steel plate itself rang out, a vibration that seemed to hang in the air long after the bullet had disintegrated. Elena held the trigger back for a full second, completing the follow-through. 5 for 5. She slowly lifted her head from the stock. She didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist. She simply reached out and flipped the safety lever to safe. The click was small, but in the silence of the range, it sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. The verdict was in. Elena stood up slowly. The movement was stiff, guarded, a negotiation between her will and the fused vertebrae in her lower back. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the 5 shots was beginning to recede, leaving behind the familiar, dull throb of chronic pain. She ignored it, just as she ignored the dozen pairs of eyes burning into her back. She didn't look at the Marines. She looked at her rifle. With practiced efficiency, she removed the empty magazine, placing it into her cargo pocket. She pulled the bolt back one last time, inspecting the chamber to ensure it was empty, then inserted a bright orange chamber flag. It was the procedure of a professional, a ritual of safety that superseded any need for celebration. To Elena, the shooting was done, and now the work was just cleanup. She reached out and began to collect her brass, the 5 empty casings scattered on the concrete table. They were massive, heavy cylinders of metal, still radiating the intense heat of the ignition. Most people would have let them cool, but Elena picked them up, her calloused fingers impervious to the temperature. Policing the brass, she murmured to herself, leave no trace. She gathered them into a small, jingling pile in her left hand. Then, she began to break down the Tac-50. She loosened the scope mount, folded the bipod legs, and placed the heavy weapon into its drag bag. The zipper closed with a long, rasping sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet range. Only when the bag was shouldered, the weight settling familiarly against her frame, did she turn to face the audience. The platoon of Marines had not moved. They stood in a loose semicircle, their postures deflated. The cocky aggression from 10 minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a bewildered reverence. They looked like children who had just seen a magic trick that frightened them. Standing front and center was Sergeant Miller. He looked stripped. His sunglasses were in his hand now, revealing eyes that darted between the distant berm and the woman standing before him. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to ask a question, but no sound came out. His entire worldview, built on physical dominance and loud authority, had just been dismantled by a woman old enough to be his mother, using a rifle he had called garbage. Elena walked up to him. She didn't stop until she was inside his personal space, the same space he had tried to invade earlier. She wasn't tall, but in that moment she loomed over him. She held out her left hand. "Sergeant," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying no anger, no triumph, just the dry weariness of the desert. Miller instinctively held out his hand, palm open, like an obedient schoolboy. Elena dropped the 5 spent casings into his hand. Clink, 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 clink. They were still hot. The heat transferred instantly to Miller's skin, startling him, but he didn't pull away. He stared at the brass cylinders, heavy and smelling of burnt powder. They were physical proof of what had just happened, totems of a skill level he couldn't comprehend. "These are for your men," Elena said, adjusting the strap of her drag bag. "Remind them that the weapon doesn't make the shooter, and wind doesn't care about your rank." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't wait for him to salute, or to stutter out an apology. She simply sidestepped him and began the long walk back to the parking lot. The sound of her boots crunching on the gravel was rhythmic and steady, fading slowly as she moved away. Miller stood there, the hot brass burning his palm, watching her figure distort in the heat waves until she looked like a wraith, blurring into the horizon. "Whew," Miller finally whispered, his voice cracking. Who the hell was that? The silence that Elena left behind was heavier than the heat. For a long time, no one moved. The dust from her departure vehicle had long settled, yet the platoon remained frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Sergeant Miller stood looking down at his hand, where the 5 brass casings were beginning to cool, losing their stinging heat, but retaining their heavy, undeniable reality. "Check the targets," Miller said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its earlier boom and bluster. Private Davis scrambled to the spotting scope, his movements jerky. He adjusted the focus ring, his hands trembling slightly. He zoomed in on the distant berm, cutting through the lingering mirage to get a clear view of the steel plate at 1,200 meters. "Well?" Miller asked, though he already knew the answer. "Clean sweeps, Sergeant," Davis whispered, pulling his eye back from the eyepiece as if it had burned him. "The plate is empty." She cleared the deck. 5 rounds. 5 hits. No splashes on the steel. She hit the casings directly. A collective murmur went through the squad. In the sniper community, hitting a man-sized target at that range was a qualification standard. Hitting a 4-inch piece of brass was a parlor trick, performed only by the gods of ballistics. And she had done it with a rifle that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. "Nice shooting!" a deep voice rumbled from behind them. Miller spun around, nearly dropping the brass. Standing near the edge of the range tower was Major Holloway, the base's range control officer. He was an older man with skin like cured leather and a cigar chomped firmly between his teeth. He had been watching the entire exchange, leaning against the railing with the amused expression of a man watching a toddler try to wrestle a wolf. Miller snapped to attention, his face flushing a deep crimson. "Major, I didn't see you there." "I know you didn't, Sergeant," Holloway said, walking down the steps slowly. He didn't return the salute immediately. He let Miller sweat in the sun. "You were too busy trying to evict the most overqualified instructor on this base." Holloway stopped in front of Miller, looking down at the brass casings in the sergeant's hand. He chuckled darkly. "She gave you the brass," Holloway noted. "That's her signature. Consider it a gift. Most people just get the silence." "Who is she, sir?" Miller asked, the question escaping him before he could stop it. "She's just a civilian contractor. Maintenance, right?" Holloway laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that matched the desert landscape. "Maintenance? Son, you just told Elena Vrova she was going to miss. Do you have any idea who that woman is?" Miller shook his head slowly. The squad gathered closer, their curiosity overcoming their discipline. 10 years ago, before your balls dropped, she was attached to a DEVGRU element operating in the Pech Valley, Holloway said, his voice dropping to a respectful tone. Official designation was technical consultant, but that was just paperwork to get her on the bird. Her call sign was Wraith. The name landed with a thud. Wraith. It was a name that floated around campfire stories in the special operations community, usually associated with impossible shots taken from impossible angles in the mountains of Afghanistan. "She was a counter-sniper," Holloway continued, looking toward the empty road where Elena had vanished. "Her job wasn't to take out targets. Her job was to hunt the other snipers who were hunting our boys. She would sit in one spot for 3 days, not moving, not sleeping, waiting for a glint of glass 3 ridges away. And she never missed. Not once." Miller looked down at the brass again. He felt a wave of nausea. He had called her sweetheart. He had mocked her strength. He had treated a predator like prey. "She retired after her spotter caught an RPG," Holloway said, his eyes hardening. She took 5 rounds of shrapnel to the back and still dragged him 2 miles to the LZ. That limp you saw? That's not age, Sergeant. That's the cost of doing business. The Major took the cigar out of his mouth and pointed it at the distant targets. You boys come out here with your fancy semi-autos and your laser rangefinders, thinking the gear makes the soldier, Holloway said, his voice cutting like a razor. Wraith just showed you that the weapon is just a tool. The weapon is the mind. And you just got disarmed by a ghost. Holloway turned to leave, pausing only to deliver the final blow. If I were you, Miller, I'd keep those casings. Drill a hole in them. Wear them around your neck. Let them remind you every day that humility is the first rule of survival. Because if this had been a real battlefield, you and your whole squad would be dead before you even heard the shot. The Major walked away, leaving the platoon alone in the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The wind picked up again, whistling through the empty firing lanes, sounding suspiciously like a low, mournful laugh. Miller closed his fist tight around the brass, the metal biting into his palm, etching the lesson into his flesh. The Armory Annex was located 2 levels below the main administration building, a subterranean bunker of reinforced concrete and recycled air that smelled perpetually of CLP gun oil and stale coffee. For Elena, this was sanctuary. The heavy steel door hissed shut behind her, engaging the magnetic locks with a thud that severed her connection to the world above. Here, the blinding white sun of Al-Sahra could not reach her. The temperature was a constant, artificially chilled 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the oven she had just stepped out of. Elena walked to her workbench in the corner, a space cluttered with disassembled trigger groups, optic mounts, and half-filled logbooks. She moved slowly, the fluid grace of the firing range replaced by a rigid, fragile shuffle. The adrenaline, that wonderful, numbing chemical that had allowed her to hold a 30-pound rifle steady in a windstorm, was evaporating rapidly. In its wake, the pain came rushing back like a breaking dam. It started at the base of her spine, where the titanium rods fused her L4 and L5 vertebrae and radiated outward in jagged lines of fire down her left leg. Her hands, which had been steady as stone minutes ago, began to tremble. She lowered the drag bag onto the workbench, treating it with more care than she treated herself. Then, she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, and simply breathed. 1, 2, 3. She counted, closing her eyes. She wasn't counting windage adjustments anymore. She was counting seconds until the spasm passed. With a grimace, she reached into the drawer of her desk and retrieved a small, amber prescription bottle. She dry-swallowed 2 pills, high-strength anti-inflammatories and a muscle relaxant. It was a cocktail she knew well, the daily fuel required to keep the machine running. She moved to the small utility sink in the corner of the room. She turned the faucet on, splashing cold water onto her face, scrubbing away the dust, the sweat, and the invisible residue of violence. When she looked up, the reflection in the scratched metal mirror stared back at her. It was not the face of a hero. It was the face of a woman who had lived 3 lifetimes in 40 years. The lines around her eyes were deep trenches carved by squinting into the sun and seeing things no one should see. Her hair was messy, the gray streaks prominent under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked tired. She looked broken. "You're getting old, Wraith," she whispered to the reflection. But then she leaned closer. Inside those tired, bloodshot eyes, something was still burning. It was a cold, blue flame, the predator that had just woken up on Range 7. The body was failing, yes, The spine was fused, the knees were shot, and the nightmares were waiting in the wings. But the mind? The mind was still a diamond. Miller had called her sweetheart. He had seen the wrapper, not the weapon. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. She didn't hate the boy. She didn't even dislike him. He was just young, and youth was a disease that only time or trauma could cure. Today, she had given him a dose of the latter. She turned back to the workbench. She unzipped the drag bag and removed the McMillan Tac-50. Under the fluorescent lights, the scratches and gouges on the stock looked even deeper. To anyone else, it was a piece of junk. To her, it was an extension of her soul. She wiped it down one last time with a silicone cloth, removing her fingerprints, removing the sand. Then, she opened the heavy weapons locker bolted to the wall. She placed the rifle into the rack, right next to the modern, pristine M110s that the other technicians worked on. The Tac-50 stood out like a wolf among sheepdogs, ugly, scarred, and infinitely more dangerous. "Rest now," she murmured. She closed the locker door and spun the dial on the combination lock. Click. The demonstration was over. The ghost could go back to haunting the machinery. She sat down in her worn-out office chair, the springs groaning in protest, and waited for the medicine to kick in, alone in the dark, cool silence of her own making. The bunker was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the distant buzz of the server racks cooling the base's logistical data. The silence here was different from the desert. It was artificial, filtered, and safe. Elena sat in her chair, the medication finally beginning to dull the sharp edges of the fire in her spine into a manageable, distant ache. She stared at the closed bottom drawer of her desk. It was locked, not with a standard key, but with a complex padlock she had brought from home. Slowly, she reached down and dialed the combination. The lock clicked open. She pulled the drawer out. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet that had been flattened by time, lay a single object. It was a heavy piece of gold anodized metal, an eagle clutching an anchor, a trident, and a flintlock pistol. The special warfare insignia. The Budweiser. It was scratched and dull, lacking the luster of the ribbons worn by the officers upstairs. Elena ran her thumb over the eagle's wing. She didn't take it out. She never took it out. To wear it now would be to invite questions she didn't want to answer, to invoke ghosts she didn't want to resurrect. It belonged to a woman who had died in the mountains years ago, a woman who could run 10 miles with a ruck and sleep in the snow. That woman was gone. Only Elena remained. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the heavy steel door. Elena looked up, her hand instinctively closing the drawer, though she did not lock it. She watched the shadow. It was broad, distinctively shaped by the outline of a plate carrier and a tactical helmet held under an arm. It was Miller. He stood there for a long time. Through the thick, soundproof door, she could hear nothing, but she could feel his hesitation. He raised a hand as if to knock, then lowered it. He shifted his weight. The arrogance that had propelled him into her range earlier that morning was gone, replaced by a paralyzing respect. He knew now that he was standing on the threshold of a different world, one he was not yet qualified to enter. Elena waited. She could have pressed the button to release the magnetic lock. She could have invited him in, offered him coffee, and given him the war story he probably craved. But that would have cheapened the lesson. Some things had to be processed alone. After a full minute, the shadow crouched down. A small, folded piece of paper slid under the rubber weather strip of the door, appearing on the concrete floor of the bunker like a white flag. The shadow stood up. Miller lingered for 1 second more, then snapped to a rigid position. Even through the distorted glass, the silhouette was unmistakable. He was saluting. A slow, held salute directed not at an officer, but at the closed door and the silence behind it. Then, he turned and walked away. The shadow faded, leaving the frosted glass blank once more. Elena exhaled, a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. She leaned forward and picked up the paper. It was torn from a field notebook, the edges rough. The handwriting was jagged, written with the heavy hand of adrenaline. It read, "I kept the brass. Thank you, ma'am." Elena stared at the note. A faint smile, genuine and devoid of bitterness, touched her eyes. She placed the paper in the drawer, right next to the golden trident. It was a fitting companion. One represented what she had been. The other represented what she had given. She pushed the drawer shut and snapped the padlock. She leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it felt lighter now. The desert wind was howling outside, miles above her head, but down here in the heart of the machine, there was peace. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the recognition. The brass on Miller's desk would speak for her long after she was gone. The fan blades spun, the servers hummed, the ghost rested,